Well, I'm going to introduce John Holschen. John has many years of service in the U.S. Special Operations community. As a civilian trainer, he has worked to convert his specialized skills in the areas of weapons and combative techniques into useful defensive curricula for private citizens.
That's pretty good.
That makes you sound really good, doesn't it?
Does it? Yeah, all right.
Now, we also have Jeff Mao, founder and head designer at Tenicor. Jeff's background is in law enforcement, including SWAT, and as a firearm and combatives instructor.
And one of the things that I started with is the concept, I now call it my civilian deadly force principles. And principle number one is the purpose of my defensive firearm is to save human life. And there's a period there. Okay, there's a period. That's it. That's its sole purpose, is to save human life. And that begins, I think, to address so many aspects of mindset, right? So many issues of what about this and what about that? And what would I do in this situation, in that situation? Start with the concept that the sole purpose of your defensive firearm is to save human life. And there's a period there. Clarity. And there's a lot of clarity there. And a lot of those questions, when people ask me, well, what about this or that? And could I? Well, then we come to two other principles. There's only three here. The second principle is, while saving human life, I'm responsible to ensure that I hurt no innocents, right? That no innocent person is hurt while acting to save life. The third one is deadly force isn't an option. It's what remains when there's no other reasonable action that would save my life or someone else who I care about's life. And if you right there with those three, you've really taken out of play a lot of the negative outcomes of, I heard a bump in the night, so I got in my backyard, so I went and got my gun, and I went out in the backyard to see what was going on, and it led to this, or this other, so many possible negative outcomes. And if you run it through the criteria, are you acting to save human life? Is there somebody's life in danger in your backyard right now? Well, then why are we going out there? Remember, the purpose of my defensive firearm was to save human life. You're walking your dog and you get attacked by another dog. Can I shoot it? Are you acting to save your life? Can you reasonably articulate that this dog is going to kill you, not your dog? Could you maybe shoot it? Yes, but you leave yourself open to a whole bunch of potential negative outcomes. That bullet ricochets and goes, even if it doesn't strike a person, it strikes someone else's house. I know a case recently where somebody's now charged with reckless endangerment, discharging a weapon in city limits, and they're still trying to decide if they want to charge him with other things too, because he shot at a dog that was attacking his dog. So again, three simple principles that I think it is now where I am starting with a lot of people when it comes to mindset. Instead of giving it as doctrinally as I used to, and a lot of background, I said, all right, I'm going to come up with a couple of simple principles and see what happens.
How do you get a person to think about the need to take a human life?
Well, tell me more. What do you mean?
Well, clearly a person's behavior at some point you have to decide necessitates that life be taken. Otherwise, why are you carrying?
Right.
Because to your point, you're protecting human life, but you're also taking it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it is just that. Is this situation such that an innocent person is going to lose their life or be so grievously harmed they're never the same again? Unless that's present, I'm not thinking about shooting. I'm thinking about getting away from the situation. I'm thinking about being a good witness while getting away from the situation. I'm thinking about keeping me and mine safe. It's got to be eminent that an innocent person is in danger of death or permanent serious injury.
Do you think some people take it to that point, but don't really contemplate that they have to kill someone?
I think a lot more people take it to, I think, yes, you're correct. But I think in the larger population, a lot more people take it too lightly. Whether they would actually fire or not remains to be seen. But in discussion, even in class, even in a fairly formal setting, their mindset is, oh, if I'm in that place and it's being robbed and he's got a gun, how do I know he won't just start shooting people? I'm shooting him. Would they actually? I don't know, but that's what they say they'll do. That's what if that guy's going to punch me in the face, I could fall down and hit my head on the curb, and I'm older and I shouldn't have to get beat up, so I'm going to shoot this guy. That's a whole nother, there's a great meme that keeps going around, great in its idiocy, that at some age, at some age, a man gets too old to take an ass kicking, he's just going to shoot you. And there's a whole meme about that I keep seeing on Facebook. And I have people bring it up and I say, and you're just going to prison. If you shoot someone to keep from getting your ass kicked, you're going to prison. That's
actually a good segue into the ramifications of what happens afterwards. Mm-hmm. Do people really think through the civil and the criminal components of it?
Yeah, of course not. Yeah. So kind of going back a step to your question, have people really thought about what it means to take a life? That is, I think, what you were really asking, what you were really getting at. And I think the answer is no. Most people have not. They've not really thought about what it means to take a life. And yes, I get the anger. I get the idea of someone stealing my stuff. It makes me very angry. It shouldn't be allowed. It should be punished. And people subconsciously or consciously cast themselves. They don't realize they're taking on the role of punisher, which of course is not authorized legally in any way, shape, or form for any individual, whether even a law enforcement officer, right? They're to bring them before the court so that the court can determine guilt and appropriate sentencing, appropriate punishment. But so many people are, I'm going to shoot him because he's going to steal my whatever. And they don't begin to contemplate what that actually means.
So we've talked about the context of someone carrying now and deciding they're going to carry. What do you think it's like the first time they actually take on that responsibility to do it?
To carry or to carry?
To carry a gun.
Just to carry a gun for the first time.
To carry a gun for the first time.
I think the thing they think about is, I'm carrying a gun, I'm carrying a gun, I'm carrying a gun, and that's about it.
Does anybody notice? How many people know I'm carrying a gun?
And everybody sees that I'm carrying a gun, so I better do this.
Right.
And I don't think they're not thinking about. They're thinking about it in a very selfish, this is what's happening to me way, and not in I have a higher calling or a higher duty or like the severity of it. And that's just the emotional first reaction to it. Those things that subsides after a while. But I think that's what I felt when I was carrying a gun for the first time. I was like, this is weird. I got a gun. So I don't know. Do you remember first time you carried a gun, like concealed?
Honestly, no.
Yeah.
I have to kind of make it up. But yes, I do remember absolutely being self-conscious about carrying and the, who's going to know. And, is it obvious that I'm carrying a gun?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So being self-conscious about it.
So now that you're carrying, where can't you go and how do you deal with it?
Well,
that was a part of you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You want to start that?
Well, where you can't go, it's kind of a personal decision, I think. Obviously, I think an important distinction is the distinction between laws and rules, right? And for any of those things, you have to decide whether there's the moral component to that as well. Are you going to follow the laws and you're going to follow the rules? Obviously, the consequences for disobeying a law is more significant to the consequence of disobeying a rule. And so if you're going to carry it into a bar, you have to be okay with that. I'm not advocating that you do that because it's most states, or not probably all states, is against the law. But I think that's an important distinction. And that's very different than I'm not going to carry in Walmart because Walmart has said you can't have guns anymore, right? That's you can make the argument that private company has said don't do this, so you're rude and inappropriate to carry a gun in there. But the consequences are just they're going to ask you to leave, and that's it, right? And so you can choose to frequent if it's a movie theater or a mall or whatever the place is that is saying you can't have guns here. That's just a personal decision that you have to make. And then the consequences.
Depending upon the state. We have to be clear that depending on, there are some states that if the property is marked in a certain way, it has the force of law. But it's one of the things you have to know about the state that you're in.
And then the thing that you have to contemplate is if I'm going to go there and I'm going to do this thing and I don't have a gun and something happens, like, how am I going to feel if I don't have I've decided I'm going to carry a gun every day to protect myself and the people I care about. And then I don't have it with me. Is that okay? And then you got to decide, okay, are you going to break the rule? You're going to leave it in the car? You're not take it with you, or you're just not going to go to that place? And a lot of that is just doing the research and the homework, I think, to know which places can you go, and then what events and tasks and things are important to you and your family and your friends and the things that you're doing in life.
Do people ask you very frequently about the frequency of carrying, period? Like, oh, well, I only carry when I fill in the blanks. Mm-hmm. Do you have a comment about it?
Well, I would say that the vast majority of people who own guns don't carry at all. The vast majority of people who have concealed carry permits do not carry at all. And then you have a large segment that carry only under certain circumstances. And of course, the reality of it is that we can point out some areas that are more likely to be hazardous than others at certain times and certain locations. But the fact of the matter is that these things, you look at active shooter events, where do they happen? Where don't they happen is really the question. So the idea that you can predict where you're going to need a gun is a pretty silly idea. So I think for most of us who get serious about it, you either carry or you don't carry is the way I look at it. And that means everywhere and all the time. I've had clients, it was kind of interesting. I did some work in security consulting that every once in a while we'd be hired when someone had some sort of high risk event, such as a high risk employee termination. And this one client contacted me and said, well, John, we want you and we want you to be armed this time. And I said, okay. And I went, and the contact looked me up and down and said, you do have a gun, right? And I said, of course. Oh, okay. And met somebody else higher up in the organization. They said, well, we thought it was important that you be armed this time because of this, and this. And you do have a gun, don't you? And the third person that asked me that, I said, how many times have I been here? How many days have I been here? And we've interacted probably close to 30 days overall. And I said, I've never not had a gun here with you. And I would have never known. So that's kind of the point. That is the point of concealed carry. You never knew. And that, I think, that's what I aspire to. And that's what I try and help people aspire to. There's no reason anyone need know unless someone need know. And that's so carry all the time. Carry everywhere you possibly can.
That's a good and faithful thing.
I think that's a good distinction. You either are or you're not. There's not an in between.
Mm-hmm.
So a person does decide to carry and they've got the right mindset. What kind of training do they really need to do?
Well, the right mindset, that opens up a whole can of worms, right? The right mindset. What do we really mean by that? And we've touched on little pieces of it here in that they really need to contemplate. They need to understand the law, the legalities. They need to conduct a really good audit of their moral belief system. You alluded to that. We need a really good self-audit of under what circumstances do you really believe that after the event, you are going to be able to tell yourself, yeah, I absolutely did what I needed to do. And I didn't do something I didn't need to do. And I can live with that. That needs to happen. So legalities, moralities. Then we come to practicality, which is now we're talking about your abilities. And a piece of that practicality are skills. What actually can you and can you not do in terms of marksmanship, that's really the biggest piece that people think about. They spend a lot of time thinking about. Some people spend a lot of time thinking about that when they think about training. But that's just one piece of it.
I think so. The question that you asked there, when they have the right mindset, you can't have the right mindset unless you do the training. Right. So it goes back to the priority survival, mindset, tactics, skill, and equipment. Mm-hmm. Those things are not separated from each other. They're things that all work together. And the way you create the mindset is to do the work, right? So you do the work of the training, you go and you shoot and you increase your marksmanship. And that is not separated from mindset. It builds confidence as you become better, which increases your mindset, increases your belief that you're prepared to deal with a violent confrontation. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to, the initial questions, which kind of ties into some of the stuff we talked about earlier, but do you believe there are people in this world that need to be hurt or killed? Right. That's the first question. And if you don't think there are, then you probably shouldn't be carrying a gun. Mm-hmm. And then if your answer is yes, then are you someone who's going to do that? Right. Which is another big question, which ties again back into what we were talking about earlier. And I think oftentimes we do, like, how we talk about it is important, right? And so oftentimes the believed risk of liability influences how we talk about it. So we talk about stopping people instead of killing them, except for we recognize that a gun or a knife is lethal force, which by definition is the only reasonable expectation of lethal force is that someone's going to die. And so if we're going to use lethal force, we are actually trying to kill somebody. We're okay if it doesn't work, right? But we use the term stop because we're afraid to use the term kill, which I totally understand. And like, that might be a bad thing for me to say. But it affects our mindset. We think about the use of the gun in some other way other than killing somebody. And we think, I'm going to shoot somebody and they're just magically going to stop because that's what happens on TV. And we think, oh, it just is over somehow. And we didn't actually kill somebody, but I mean, it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And like, I think that's where mindset starts, is understanding the consequences of what you're doing, being willing to carry it out and believing that, and not just that, there is also the consequence of, if you don't do it, like, now you got to live with yourself. Like, you were in a situation where you had a gun and there was somebody killing innocent people and you didn't do anything. And can you live with yourself? And there's some people who could, right? They couldn't live with themselves doing it, but there are other people who, like, the fact that maybe they had a gun and they didn't use it, or that was the day they didn't carry a gun. And it's like, talk about post-traumatic stress, right? I mean, that's like, that'd be a difficult thing. So I think that's like, the training should all support the mindset, and that's how you get the mindset. How you get the mindset is doing the work and going through the training, whether it is mental conditioning, thinking about different scenarios, whether it is skill building, whether it is learning how to talk to people and interact with people, and whether it's legal, understanding the legal components to what you're doing, when and where you can carry. All of that stuff builds confidence and reinforces the mindset, which is the thing that puts you in a position to be successful in the confrontation.
Absolutely. I think an aspect of that as well is that our knowledge of the situations should also inform and guide what we choose to practice physically. One of the things that I do with in early classes is I ask people to do a real brief exercise and close their eyes and imagine that they're in a situation where they had to use their firearm to defend themselves or someone else. Situation doesn't matter. You've had to shoot. You have shot. It's over. The police have already been there. The investigation is done. You were found to be without fault. Now, how many times did you fire when you shot that guy? And we go around the room and I have people write it down so that other people don't hear it. And if I do that, what I find is an amazing number of people that will say, to me, an amazing number. If I've got 20 people in class, typically 3 or 4 will say, well, I didn't actually shoot. I showed him my gun and challenged him and he quit. He went away. And then about 40% will say they shot once. And that solved the problem and they went away. And it's often it's more than 40%. It's more like 60% shot 1 to 2 shots and that solved the problem. And then I talk about actual gunfight statistics and what you might actually need to do and say, so when we go to the range, what do you want to practice? Well, how about practicing actually being able to fire enough that would be likely to solve the problem based on what we know about the problem? So getting into mindset should help us with the decision making. It should help us consider all of these situations and what we need to practice, what we need to mentally practice, rehearse. All of those are aspects that you got to make part of your preparation.
Well, John, we've asked you here today because clearly this discussion is right up your alley. And I'm curious, how did you get to this point?
It's a good question. It's a question I don't have a clear-cut answer to. How did we get where we are in life? What began to shape us? Our parents, of course, our environment, but more important than that, I think family and expectations. And the reality is that I grew up with a concept that one of the things it meant to be a man was to be able to take care of people around you. That was one of the criteria.
A protector.
And in order to do that, there were times that weapons were necessary. And yeah, so that's honestly, that's where it starts. And then, I grew up around guns. I grew up, we went down to the gravel pit shooting for fun. Grew up, never a lot of serious hunting, but when I say serious, big game hunting or anything like that. But my granddad had me out hunting rabbits and squirrels and quail and pheasant pretty young. So grew up comfortable around firearms. But that's really a different thing. I mean, that's a comfort around firearms, but really grew up with the idea that one of the things it meant to be a man was to be capable of protecting people around you.
Jeffrey, how about you?
Again, that is a difficult question to answer, I think, because there isn't just one thing. I think that I have a very strong desire to do right and of justice, and that's always been something that, even as a little kid, that I saw things like, that's not right. People shouldn't do that. That's always been something that's important to me. And not just doing right, but helping people who can't help themselves to make things right has always been important to me. So if I see something that's wrong, putting myself in a position to help somebody with that thing. And then, just like any little boy, like guns and army and police was cool. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that I can use those tools and or those jobs and those things and those tactics to help to do right is something that I think is awesome. And I think that's what led me to ultimately be a police officer. And I think that's the thing that, when there's work that needs to be done, I'm excited to go do that work. Mm-hmm. Versus, and there's some people who aren't, they want to run away and hide and not be part of that. And that's not necessarily a bad or immoral thing. That's just how God made that person, and God made me a different way. And we need people who will go solve those problems. And I feel convicted about that. And that's why I carry a gun every day. Even I'm not a police officer anymore. It's almost been a year now. But I still carry a gun every day because that's just who I am. And that's what I believe. And if there's a situation in front of me, I don't long for there to be a situation, but if there is a situation, sign me up, kind of thing, right? Yeah. I mean, mm-hmm. if that needs to be done, then there's a certain segment of people that want to go solve those problems. And it should be really weird if that was everybody. Mm-hmm. It would actually be really, really bad society if that was everybody, but we need some of those people to do those things.
I think I hear a little unstated something. I put words in your mouth, but there's a little bit of with ability comes responsibility, I think, as well.
Yep.
And because you have the capability of doing these things. With that, there is a sense of, then I have a responsibility to use that capability.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And then there's also, I think, and I think you probably feel this way as well, a responsibility that if you are good at sharing that information with other people and helping other people to make them better with it as well, then there's great joy and satisfaction in doing that. So whether it is having a conversation on a podcast or whether it is running a course, and whether that's for private citizens or whether that's for law enforcement, military, or whatever, there's great satisfaction in taking the experience and the skill set and the way you think about things and helping other people understand that and do things better themselves. And knowing that the things you're doing, that maybe I'm not a full-time police officer anymore, but I can interact with people who are doing that job still, and I can make them better cops, then obviously there's great satisfaction in that. Or somebody who's in the military, if that person can shoot better because they come and hang out with me for a couple of days, that's pretty cool, because that person's now better at their job. Sure. They're more confident. Yeah. Their mindset is better prepared, and they can go do work that I'm not going to do that is going to make me safer and make my family safer and make us make this a better place to live.
Sure.
I know both of you do not like to talk about yourselves, but in honing these skills and getting to where you are today, you both have dedicated a lot of time and a lot of hours in honing those skills.
A lot more time on this.
Well, and I think
only because I've been doing it longer. Thanks.
I'm interested in hearing a little bit more of the background that brought you to this point where you really can be a mentor to people, as you have been with Jeff, and now Jeff is a mentor to many other people. I think the listener would be interested to see what does that look like? What did that journey look like?
Okay. Well, I started off shooting small bore competition in junior high school, actually, and as far as developing weapon skills. But at the same time, I started studying martial arts in junior high school. And so, again, that was personal skills. But I think the theme here is again, for me, even though I had a career in the military and, a lot of focus there, and then taught a lot of law enforcement for a lot of years, that's all important. But really my passion has always been, and is even stronger now, is the individual. And that individual, if they can live less fearfully, if they can live more empowered, if they can live, it's not worrying about a boogeyman behind every bush. It is knowing there's a bush there and there could be a hole to fall in. There could be a bad person or a rabid dog or whatever, helping pass that on. So along the way, where that segues in is I spent a lot of time in places that helped me hone my observational skills and my interaction skills. Interaction is really such a big piece of this that is completely missing from so many training programs, and frankly from so many people's focus of what they need to spend training time and effort on. It's real easy. I can fill dozens and dozens of shooting classes every year, offer a couple of tactics classes a year, and you're lucky if they're half full, because people don't realize the need. And when I say a tactics class, I'm talking about private citizens, what it takes to interact in these situations in a way that maximizes your safety and security and the people that are with you that you care about. So I got to travel a lot in the military. First, I guess back up a step, I grew up a military brat, and that means we moved every couple of years. I lived in 10 states before I left my parents' household. So that's a lot of moving around. You're always the new kid. You need to fit in, and that helps your communication skills. It helps your awareness of various behaviors so that you can actually model those behaviors. You become somewhat of a chameleon to fit in better and to communicate with people. And I think a heightened sense of when there's security issues. I moved from a little town in the Midwest to going to school in the Bronx my first year of junior high school. And that was one heck of a shock. And a lot of learning took place that year. Moved on from there into a career in the military, continued to shoot competitively in the civilian world, moved over to handguns, shooting competitively both in the military and in the civilian world a little bit. But even while doing that, I quickly found that I really wasn't interested in competing in things that didn't translate to what I perceived actual usage to be. So I had a limited attention span and willingness to spend time in scraping a tenth or two off my reload when I just don't feel that's significant in the vast majority of civilian situations, for example. Had a career in the military and special operations, which meant traveling the world, going into a lot of places, often not like today, not all kitted up with everything on ready for battle. But again, having to fit into environments where our guns were locked up in a big box somewhere back, where we were staying at best, and moving around thinking, okay, if something happens, what are we going to do? What am I going to do? How am I going to acquire weapons? System, and what am I going to do with it? And then into concealed carry. And that was where today so many people with a strong military background have been involved in the global war on terror for X number of years. The vast, vast majority of their experience is full up hard armor and long guns, where in my era, at least 50% of the time, really more like 3/4 of the time that I was armed, it was concealed, whether it was under a uniform under civilian clothes. So that translated over for me quite easily into the civilian setting. And had some jobs in the military that involved training people that were going to be in non-uniform status at all times and in small elements. So again, that translated over as well. So yeah, that's kind of where the hard skills came from, I think.
How about you, Jeff?
What was the question again? I was just listening to John.
I was mesmerized, right? The question was, you're in a position today to influence people. You can mentor people. You're quite good at what you do. How did you get there?
Diligent practice.
Yeah.
Well, yes, that's what I want to hear.
So just a desire to be better myself, and then a desire to share that with other people. I mean, my journey is just as a guy, and I decided to become a cop. But I took it seriously. So like I started carrying a gun when I was 21 and when I could carry a gun. And it took a couple years for me to really take that. I mean, I thought about it intently. And I guess I sought out the best training I had at the time, which at the time was just a friend.
The key compared to, we both known a lot of cops and trained a lot of cops, and we don't have to talk about percentages or not trying to denigrate anybody, but a lot of cops take the training offered to them and they may apply themselves quite well to that training, but they don't seek anything out beyond that.
Yep. So, I mean, just me deciding to carry a gun, I was like, I should do this. One, it's fun to shoot a gun. I should be better at it. And so I should go practice stuff. And so in the beginning, it was just like a buddy who did some informal IDPA stuff and let's go shoot and learn to draw. But then when I decided a couple of years later, yes, I want to be a police officer, I was like, I should figure out how to use a gun and how to fight. Because if I don't, I'm probably not going to be very good at being a police officer. And so I spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of resources, and I started taking classes. And that's where I found Insights Training Center, and I took a ton of classes even before I became a cop. One, because it was fun, but two, I knew that that's where I wanted to be eventually. And so then eventually I got hired on and as a police officer. But I had this foundation, and really in some ways it's like the best thing, but it was the worst thing as well.
Why is that?
It was the best thing because I understood I had a good foundation on how to do stuff, but I also, so like Greg had asked me to be a coach and instructor before I even became a cop. So I was like understanding how to communicate information and convey stuff. And so it kind of spoiled me and it kind of ruined me as I moved into the government and how the government does stuff. And again, I'm the guy who's like the perfectionist, always trying to do right. And so that balance of the way the government does stuff and the way a high level place in the private sector does stuff who's trying to do it, like those two are incongruent, and there was always that tension there. And so frankly, that was something that plagued me my entire career, that tension of desiring to make the most of everything that we had, whether it was, in most law enforcement training is shoot the 45 rounds you have on your person, go take a break and come back in 10, 20, 30 minutes with loaded mags. But in private sector training, it's like, we're going to shoot this. You better have ammo in your pocket and keep things going because we're going to shoot these drills. And I don't care.
Having done your class, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah. And so just that perspective on trying to be efficient with time, trying to be efficient with your resources was really big and really important to me. And it wasn't big and important to some of my colleagues at the time. There were some folks it was, and it worked out. Overall, I think it worked out really well. And then in the context of that, I always sought out additional training. And I sought out other colleagues and people who shared those beliefs with me and felt like being prepared and training was really important. And so like SWAT was something I gravitated towards. And even in that community where everyone is already like, people have chosen a different path and they've chosen a different level of commitment. I mean, even in that space, there's people with varying levels of commitment, right? And so
I think you hit something really important early in terms of mindset for training. What I commonly see in some settings is people are training to a standard. I have to achieve X percentage of hits in X amount of time in order to pass this qualification so that I continue to do my job. People that, like ourselves, that's not how we look at it. It's never good enough. It's never, I want more accuracy always. And I look at that time and go, well, gosh, I'm not going to have anywhere near that amount of time in a gunfight. That's silly. I need to do that in half that amount of time. Now I've got half that amount of time with 98% accuracy. All right, let's see if I can get a quarter of that time with 98% accuracy. Oh, well, I dropped down to 90% accuracy. Now it's not good enough. Practice some more. And that, I think, is one of the, that is the differentiator really as we go along with so many of these people is, and honestly, that is a lot of aspects of life, isn't it? There are people that are trying to achieve the minimum standard. And there are people who, I was lucky, I think, from martial arts. My martial arts instructors taught me that you're always seeking perfection. They had been involved in this for 30, 40 years, 50 years in some cases. And they portrayed that they are still trying to get greater perfection of everything they're doing. And if you can get that attitude early on in your training, and then get after it and go find training, that will take you a long ways.
Yep, you're gonna get the most out of it.
Well, I think, a concept that that resonates for me from what you're saying is that I spend time and I tell people that I've taught, my kids from the time they were young. The concept today that seems to be taught and accepted in so much of society is that violence is never the answer. And I believe that's just absolutely false. It is absolutely Pollyanna thinking. I believe that, in fact, there are times that violence is the only appropriate answer. And the fact of the matter is, whether it's, it's easy to make the animal analogy, whether it's, if you're faced with violence, if you're faced with wrongful violence, there is a time that violence is the only appropriate answer, and the appropriate level of violence applied sooner can actually keep you from having to use higher levels of violence later. And it's that ability, it's the confidence that comes from the ability to say, okay, I can do this thing. And that goes back, martial arts. Somebody at one point said something to me about, I was in a situation, reacted a certain way, and they asked me why I didn't react a different way. And I said, well, because I knew I could handle that. And they said, well, you're pretty damn cocky or something like that. And I said, well, look, I practice this thing between 30 and 40 hours a week. And I've been doing that now for about 5 years. And I don't care if it's tiddlywinks. If you practice tiddlywinks 40 hours a week for 5 years, you're not really too worried when somebody challenges you to a tiddlywink competition. We need that. We need that understanding that it's got to start from a willingness. It's got to start from an awareness that sometimes violence is the only answer. Now I need to develop the tools, if I'm going to fill that role, to be able to do that.
There's a little bit of worldview perspective in that too, because you have to ask the question, does evil really exist, or are people basically good?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, with the violence, violence is either the answer or it's not.
Right. Exactly.
That's the clear line. There's no gray area with it. It's like you have a problem and violence is the solution, or it's not. Mm-hmm. And when it is the solution, that's the only option.
Right.
And when it's not the solution, you could use violence, but it's not going to work very well. And the reason why
it'll be wrong.
It'll be wrong. And the reason why people don't like violence is because there's too many people who use violence when they're not supposed to. Mm-hmm. No one has a problem with you being violent when violence is the only answer. Really, nobody has a problem with that.
I don't know about that. I've run into people. I run into people that have told me that they would not use a certain level of violence to protect themselves from a certain level of crime. And I'll be specific. I used to help some what were 30 years ago, militant activist women, they've self-identified as such, people that became famous as editors of certain magazines and so on. I used to help them teach anti-rape classes, mostly as a punching bag. But we had ladies in class that would say, oh no, I could live with being raped easier than I could live with killing someone. And okay, you need to know you. You need to know you. So there are people out there, more than I would like to think existed, that do believe that violence is never the answer. And for them, it becomes never the answer for them.
Fair enough. Most people would, I think,
I would hope,
are going to who most people, even people who would kind of without thought say violence is never the answer. Mm-hmm. When there's actually, like, when the guy is walking through the school shooting little kids, and you show up
as violence
and shoot that guy, they're like, yay, thank you for doing that. Yeah. Right. I mean, most people are going to fall into that camp. Sure. And the extreme philosophical pacifists is certainly exist. I obviously granted that. But it's, I think, less than the emotional, oh, we should never be violent person.
Yeah, maybe I teach in some groups downtown and in downtown Seattle. I teach some business related subjects, and I get a lot of people who right now they believe violence is never the answer. Yes. I'm not sure if they were not put in the situation that you're describing that they might change their belief. Yep. But right now they believe
for sure
that they believe
probably isn't the answer
that violence is not the answer
for them to act for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like the point of this is if someone decides to carry, these actually are things they ought to be thinking about.
Exactly. Sure.
For sure.
Yep. Now, there's a caveat I like to put in there, though, because in firearms classes, sometimes it seems that the bias goes the other way, that a larger segment will believe that they should get involved at the level of deadly force in situations that I certainly wouldn't use deadly force in. And so I find myself speaking to that a lot because it can lead to such negative outcomes. I tell people that my objective is to ensure, to the best of my ability, that their techniques, tactics, training, and equipment are optimized to win 3 battles: the physical battle, the legal battle, and the moral ethical battle that may happen inside. And so I find it necessary to spend a good bit of time, and maybe I'm jaded from some expert witness work I've done and times that I've been subpoenaed to appear in court because somebody bought a gun, took no training, started carrying a gun, got in a situation and shot somebody that they weren't legally justified shooting them in. They didn't go out and criminally choose to create a criminal act. They didn't go out to rob somebody, but they used deadly force wrongfully. And so I think it's important that we balance that as an instructor. It's really important that I balance that I reach those people as well, because they've already self-selected into carrying a gun and come into shooting school. I need to work on making sure that they understand the limitations of deadly force, that it truly is limited to deadly situations.
Which really raises the question, it's almost negligence if you choose to carry a gun and you don't contemplate these things and get proper training.
Well, you've got to get the knowledge somewhere. There's so much misinformation. There are so many Facebook memes, like we mentioned earlier, that, I'm too old to take an ass kick and I'm just going to shoot him. Well, you're just going to prison. And that we really have to combat that. As an instructor, I think it's important to get people to realize that. I get people that will quote the law to me and they'll say, well, it says this is a justified use of force. And I say, well, one of the first things to realize is in most states, the force statutes and the deadly force statutes are 2 different statutes. If you're quoting the one that says force, most of the time that specifically means it's not justifying deadly force, or it'd be over there in the other statute. So we really need to understand that the use of force and the use of deadly force are 2 completely different things in the eyes of the law, and literally never the twain shall meet, right? You're never legally authorized to use deadly force in a situation that is authorizes only the use of force, particularly as a private citizen.
Yeah. And, castle doctrine is a thing where that comes up, where people are like, oh, I could shoot anybody in my house. And that's not that simple. But people come with that perspective of, oh, but there's castle doctrine in this state or that or whatever it is. And, oh, if there's someone there, I'm going to shoot him regardless. And it's just terrifying that people want to simplify the process that much and not think through it and not internalize the consequences.
I spend a lot of time bringing out the potential negative consequences. I mean, from the point of shooting a family member or someone who, one most recently that was in the news was the fellow that traveled from Denmark to visit here, a relative in the United States that didn't know he was coming, arrived at his house late at night, 11, 12 o'clock, and did something at the back door and hid and jumped out of the bushes to surprise his father-in-law, who shot him dead. I know of the case that the guy who came home at lunchtime to pick up something that he needed at work that he had forgotten in the morning, and he ran in the house to get whatever. He realized there was someone in the house. No one should be home. He had an adult daughter, or not adult, but a teenage daughter in school. His wife was at work. He armed himself and began searching the house. He could hear someone moving. They ended up in a closet in a spare room. He ended up shooting through the door and killing his daughter, who was skipping school. She was hiding from dad. There's just so many, when people say, oh, anybody that's in my house that doesn't belong, I'm going to shoot them. Man, there's just so many ways that can go wrong. And then the planning of, how do you plan to not have to do that? That's the key. To me, it's not the question when we get into this, when people ask me, well, when can I shoot him? Or in effect, they're asking, can I shoot him if? And the question isn't when can you shoot him? The question is, when do I have to shoot him? When is there no other option that is reasonable? That's when you do it. And not a fraction of a second later, right? I'm not saying withhold deadly force when it's authorized. You go from 0 to 250. However, you really need an understanding of where those lines are.
Well, we leave with the admonition of get training.
Yes, exactly. I think that, throw one thing in there with that is that many of us grew up in households where there was no shortage of gun knowledge, and you might have been taught a good bit about gun knowledge and might actually be really a safe and knowledgeable gun handler. Did they have the same ability to teach you the legal knowledge that you need? And did they? If not, and yes, we all have some ability to read it on our own, but you know what? It's a lot easier to go to somebody who really has the background, has done the work, and can help ensure that you don't have misconceptions. Then go continue to study on your own and do your own reading.
Yeah. When it comes to training, it is you need to interact with the material in such a way that it changes your life, right? Because if it doesn't alter behavior, then it's actually not effective. And so just reading about it, if that's enough to alter your behavior and affect an outcome and change a potential outcome, then that's enough. For most people, it's not. And they need to interact with it on a variety of different levels, whether that's researching on their own, attending a course, talking to friends. There's all of those ways people need to interact with information and get training. And really you're trying to get training, not to check a box. You're trying to get training so how you understand the use of deadly force and the use of your weapons affects how you use them. So it affects the outcome in hopefully a more positive way and not in a negative way.